Today's talk is titled The History of the Salinan Indians on the Central Coast, delivered by Michael Woody. Michael Aaron Woody serves as council member of the Salinan tribe of Monterey and San Luis Obispo counties, bringing his heritage and deep community roots to his work throughout the Central Coast. He holds a master's in public administration from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and a BS in civil engineering from Fresno State. With 25 years of engineering experience, Michael brings a unique combination of technical expertise and public policy insight to complex community challenges. Michael's Central Coast commitment and civic engagement includes serving on several boards in Morro Bay and has contributed to the management of the Carrizo Plains through the Bureau of Land Management. Michael is a regular guest on Hometime Radio KVEC and Sound Off on KPRL. In his role as tribal liaison, he works with the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, NOAA, and the San Miguel and San Antonio missions, bridging indigenous perspectives with environmental and historical preservation efforts. Michael? I'm assuming you pressed the green button.
Okay. Thank you so much. I always get a little embarrassed when I do a presentation. Because I know that I have to keep up with whatever Ted said about me right now and impress all of you. I'm often asked about how did you get into Harvard, and I said, well, it's real simple. I went to Harvard Yard, mowed their lawn, and they felt sorry for me. So there you go. So that's the story behind this. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's, in all honesty, it is. It's always an honor to talk about Indian cultural heritage and perspectives. I always like to make sure that everybody understands that, you know, for me to talk about this, why it's such an honor is because, you know, the people that I'm talking about and the cultures I'm talking about are truly amazing people. And I am just extremely blessed and lucky to actually come from some of this and to be able to share my experience, my family's experience, and the stories of what happened here in California. I promise I'm not going to ruin your day. It's going to be okay. Click the green button?
I think. Yep.
Yeah, the Harvard diploma paid off. I got it. The history of, very quickly, I want to go through just a quick historical reminder of what happened here in California. Beginning in 1769, we ended up having, can you hear? Okay. That beginning in 1769, the Spanish government came in and started the formation of what ended up being the 21 missions developed along the coast of California. And the running joke I have with everybody is make sure you all understand, if you ever want to know the trivia question, how many missions we have, just remember 21. Now, how do you remember that? Well, that's, you know, just think of Indian casinos and blackjack. It's like 21, that's how you remember all this. After the missions were done, the Spanish missions had gone through, Mexico ended up breaking away from Spain, ended up having their own independence, and then the missions got taken over by the Mexican government in 1821. And by 1834, the Mexican government decided not to support the missions at that time, so therefore what you ended up with was the secularization of those missions in 1834. And that's what led to the breakdown of the mission systems beginning in 1834 at that moment. The two primary missions in which the Salinan culture comes from are both from the San Antonio mission, which is the third mission in the chain of 21, and the second one, which would be the San Miguel mission, which would be in the north part of San Luis Obispo County, which ended up being the 16th mission in the founding 21 missions that we have here today. If you ever get a chance, please visit those two missions, amongst all the missions throughout California. They're absolutely beautiful, can tell you a wonderful history of California. During this time, as many of you might know, there were also land grants granted from the Spanish government and also from the Mexican government. The two that affected the Salinan culture, which the Salinan culture is generally speaking from the middle part of Monterey County all the way down to the middle part of San Luis Obispo County. So it's generally speaking, it's the northern half of SLO County, southern half of Monterey County. Now, just as a reminder in all this, before 1850, and before we became a state of California, where we started surveying property. We had property lines. Back then, there really wasn't property lines. And when you talk about the different cultures, Salinan, Chumash, Yokuts, Iroquois, you have to remember they did not see this land as this is the property line, we're going to go out there with surveying equipment. Cultures overlapped like a rainbow. So sometimes when you hear people talk about how there was, here's the cultural boundary for Yokuts, Salinan, Costanoan, Chumash, Miwoks, that really wasn't true. Cultures overlapped like this, historically. One of the grants that was up there in the north, in the south part of Monterey County was called the Milpitas Land Grant, which ended up being a fraudulent land grant, which plays into this story. And the next one was called the Asuncion Land Grant, which was in the northern part of San Luis Obispo County. If you could imagine, it was basically bounded by Paso Robles and Templeton and Atascadero, going towards Morro Bay through the Santa Lucia mountain ranges, in that general area. If you see the line that goes down like this on that map, that's kind of where the 41 is between Atascadero and Morro Bay. It kind of goes right through that area. Give a perspective on that. And there was that area that was the home of the Toro Creek Indians. The Milpitas Land Grant was the home of what's called the Indians Ranch, and we're going to get to that so I can explain this story real quick. But to give you an idea of some of the problems that this grant had, we know through records through San Luis Obispo County that the position of this land grant changed over time, and we have the records to show that. The reason why this is important, because this ended up moving a tribal group of Indians that lived in the area called the Toro Creek Indians. And this was part of their legal problem that they ended up with in the 1930s with their movement of their property out there. To the Milpitas Land Grant, which was in the southern part of Monterey County, what we ended up with out there was when that land grant, which was a fraudulent land grant, when that came in, the Indians lost their property at the San Antonio Mission. They ended up having to move about 10 miles northwest of the San Antonio Mission, where it is today, and they ended up going to an area that ended up being called the Indians Ranch in Monterey County. That's where the Indians had to migrate to. Now, it is still up there underneath, if you can see the little house that's up there in the upper left-hand corner. That Indians Ranch adobe ended up being purchased in the early 1930s by the Dedini family, really wonderful family that I've gotten to know over time. But what they ended up doing is they ended up creating called the Sportsman's Ranch Club out there when they bought the old adobe. Now, interesting enough, when the property was purchased, they built their sports club around it, as you can see in that building up in the upper left. Interesting enough, that surrounding ended up preserving the adobe that's on the inside of that ranch. So many of the adobes were lost over time. This one ended up being quite a bit preserved because of the loss of the property, ended up being purchased by this family. And of course, the second one was the Toro Creek Indian Settlement in the Asuncion Grant. And this was, located between Morro Bay and Atascadero, just off of Highway 1. So if you ever drive in on that road, you'll see as you're driving from Atascadero down to Morro Bay on your right-hand side, you will see a little road called Toro Creek. It's where, I keep forgetting the name of it. It's the halfway station restaurant there. Okay, that's Toro Creek. That's the Toro Creek Road. And that land was lost back in the 1930s to a lawsuit that took place. And this goes back to what I had brought up earlier, that this lawsuit was largely based on the movement of property lines that ended up taking place. These represent just some of the articles that appeared in the San Luis Obispo Tribune at the time that's talking about what happened to the Indian settlement that was up there and what happened with that land. In essence, what took place is that there was a lawsuit over the property owners at the time, which was the Marais family. and they felt that the Indians did not have the right to live on his property because he owned it up there. And the Indians made it clear that on their side of it was, well, we've had rights to this property for many, many decades, if not centuries. The problem that they ran into with all this lawsuit was something very simple. The Indians out there really didn't even speak English. Most of them spoke Spanish at the time, at the Toro Creek settlement. And they really didn't understand, were not represented well. When they lost their initial court case in SLO County, the Department of Justice came in actually in the 1920s, late 1920s and early 1930s, and represented the Indians up there. And appealed to the state of California. And the state of California, they lost on the appeal. And the reason why they lost on the appeal was because they felt that too much time had passed in order for this to take place. Now, it is my grandfather and my grandmother, my grandfather that was born and raised with his brothers and sisters at the Toro Creek Indian Settlement. And he was born in 1914, passed away in 2004. But he was part of this entire process that took place out there. Now, one of the things that took place in the early part of the century, right around this was taking place, was the Indians. There was a gentleman, his name is John Harrington, who was an ethnologist from the Smithsonian. He was really into languages, and he would travel all throughout the North America and interview and preserve languages throughout the area, including Indian native languages. Part of his tour that he took was he came out here to the northern part of San Luis Obispo, and actually all throughout California, but some of the Indians that he visited were from the Salinan culture. Now, in this map here, when he would come visit the Indians would take them all throughout the region and point out the Indian names and where things were located throughout the area. For this culture, the Salinan culture and his languages, he recorded roughly about 4,000 pages of handwritten notes that are on file with the Smithsonian, that the Smithsonian has been kind enough to allow me and so many of others to go through these and to carefully start documenting what he actually wrote. Sadly, they didn't have iPads at the time, and trying to decipher handwritten notes that were written on the fly out there in the fields can be very difficult at times. One of the maps to show you how far-reaching this was one of the trips that they took with the Indians, started in Toro Creek, from the Toro Creek settlement, and actually went down towards Morro Bay. And that day trip in March of 1934, I believe it was, March of 1934, ended up going down to Morro Bay and up the coastline all the way up through into Monterey County. Now, what you see here is a couple of photographs from that trip and some of the notes from the map over here. On the left, I was able to take this and to show exactly what that trip looked like on that particular few days that they traveled. At the upper picture that they took up there, that is actually Cayucas up there. Now, if you look real carefully, and this is a hard one to see, I'm just going to step off of this real fast. Right in the middle of that picture up there, that is when you're traveling towards town. If you know the very first road you can take to get into Cayucas, where the very first turnoff is, if you pull into that neighborhood and you look down, that little building there, which was at a time it was a offshore water electrical generator type project that they were trying to do there back in the 1920s, 1930s. That little piece of concrete building is actually still there. It's broken down a bit, but you can see it. But that's where this is in Cayucas. The second picture here, as many of you know, this is at Piedras Blancas Lighthouse. The Indians that are standing there, on the left is Maria Ensenales Bailon. In the center is Maria de Los Angeles Bailon Ensenales. In the center, just to her right is her grandson, and to the far right is Jose Bailon. Jose Bailon and Maria de Los Angeles Bailon are the sisters of my great-grandmother, Maria Antonia Bailon from Toro Creek. The very bottom picture, of course, is Ragged Point. Now, on the right, you will see a map. Now, this map here, kind of hard to read. It's upside down, so north would be going down. And if you can imagine, Toro Creek would be in the upper left-hand corner. They came down to the coastline, and what you see here on the lines on the left are all the different streams that were notated by Harrington. If you see at the very top, hard to read, but that is the El Moro stream, or Arroyo El Moro. Going further down is the Toro Creek stream, which is Arroyo del Toro. Go a few more down, that is the Arroyo for Cayucos. The next one down is the Villa. The one down here with the little dot, right here. That's the, if you look carefully, it's S Rosa, that's the Santa Rosa. And the little dot with the line coming in, read it carefully, that's Cambria. Then you go to the San Simeon. The Pico Creek is the last, and the one before it is Arroyo de, I can't read it, they're hard to read, but yes. But yeah, this was outlining the map that they took showing their path. And in fact, when you see the San Simeon Arroyo, if you can look real carefully, just underneath Cambria, it points out that's the cement bridge there. So this is the notes from the trip that actually took us right through this community, showing the Salinan culture in this area. Wow. And there are thousands of pages of maps like this all throughout Monterey and San Luis Obispo County. This particular stop at the Piedras Blancas, if you have not been to the Piedras Blancas Lighthouse, they have an amazing tour out there. I think they do it once a week. I think it's like a $20 reservation fee. Take the tour, I'm telling you. It's absolutely amazing. This is when they took that picture there. The notes on the left, really hard to read, but we were able to transcribe what all the notes were, pointing out the entire story of what took place here when they visited the Piedras Blancas Lighthouse. In the cap, the second to the left, was the, I want to make sure I get his name right, was Mr. George Lahamadou, and he was the keeper of the station for the lighthouse at Piedras Blancas. This is one of the very few pictures we have of him record-wise, and we were able to confirm this through his family, that is in fact him. And it's one of the very few pictures of him. So the outreach of the Salinan culture was incredible with these people, and they were extremely supportive of what they were all doing there and touring the counties to show here are the different areas throughout this region that were part of Salinan culture. And it's beautiful when you get out there and you actually see that rock in person. It's almost breathtaking when you see it. The last thing I'd like to talk about real quick is, because I get a lot of questions about this, our tribal group is one of 12 tribal groups being considered for federal acknowledgement here today in Washington, D.C. It took me about the last 3 or 4 years to put this application together with the help of a couple other people in my tribe, and it was an incredible eye-opening experience. As I like to share with people, when they hear the phrase federal acknowledgement and to be federally recognized, a couple things come to mind. I think the first thing that comes to a lot of people's mind is, are you going to have a casino? The answer is that is not even on anybody's radar, I can assure you. But what I'd like to do is get to a question that I know that a lot of people have been asking about, and I've been interviewed over, which is, what is federal acknowledgement? Because sometimes that's widely misunderstood. Now, if there's a takeaway from the whole thing on today, I asked there's a couple things that you take away from this presentation. Number one, my mother made cookies and they're really, really good. Number two is to realize that there is a fundamental difference in the eyes of the government between what's called a culture and a tribal line. When you hear the phrase Salinan, Chumash, Cherokee, Yokut, when you hear those phrases, actually those are cultural linguistic identifiers of a great culture, of a cultural region, but does not reflect a tribal line as defined by the federal government. What the federal government is looking for is they're looking for a group of Indians that are in continuous existence since European contact as a group cluster of Indians. Now, let me give you an example. I think most of you are aware of the extremely wonderful and beautiful casino that's down there in Santa Ynez. If you haven't been, they have good food there. That, if you look at their name very carefully, they're called, even though they're called the Chumash tribe, they're actually called legally the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. They are a band of Indians that come from the Chumash culture. And sometimes that gets confusing. I have a lot of academics that get this wrong. A lot of reporters get this wrong. But when you kind of see that, it's kind of twisted when you first think about it. But when the government is asking for you to provide the evidence of federal acknowledgement for your tribe, they're not asking about a historical accounting of the culture that you descend from. They're asking for a tribal group that is still in existence here today. The tribal group that I come from is a tribal group that starts with the San Antonio Mission Indians that ended up being moved out northwest of the mission to the Indians Ranch Adobe through the Ensenales family in Eusebio Ensenales, who is my great-great-great-grandfather, that we've been able to identify through government records, ended up having his daughter, Clara Ensenales, who married Onisimo Bailon from the San Miguel Mission, and how they were able to migrate down to Templeton, Atascadero, and down to Toro Creek as the Bailons and many of the other Indians that were living at Toro Creek that had my grandfather ended up coming down here and staying together as a band of Indians throughout the 20th century to me today. In general, that is the band of Indians that came down here that we have applied for federal acknowledgement from the Salinan culture. So that's kind of it's kind of, if you've always seen it a certain way, that Salinan is Salinan Indians or Chumash Indians, that's the fine line legal difference with the federal government. That's what they're asking for when they say, what is federal acknowledgement and what is a group of Indians? And that's kind of a little, it's like once you see it, you can't unsee it. But for a lot of people, this became oh, I see how this works now. So sometimes when you hear the phrase, oh, I'm part of the, let's say Chumash or Cherokee, or let's say Cherokee. I'm my great-grandfather or great-great-great-grandfather was Cherokee, therefore I'm part of the Cherokee tribe. Actually, federally, most people don't know this, but there are 6 bands of tribes that are federally recognized today that are from the Cherokee culture. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense what I've been driving at here on this one. So that's where some of the confusion comes into play on this. And I am more than happy to answer so many other questions about that. But in essence, that's a little bit about the history. I know I've got a couple more minutes. One thing I want to touch on here is a little bit about California history. California is the only state that that the federal government never negotiated properly with for the land out here. Now, many places across the United States, yes, they negotiated for reservations and land and whatnot, and those treaties were violated. But California was a little different. When California became a state in 1850, under the Treaty of Hidalgo, because it was under the purview of the Louisiana Purchase, which required the federal government to negotiate with Indians for their land and purchase that land through negotiations, the federal government came into the state and began negotiations with about the first third of the Indian population out here. And after they got done with that, they sent those 18 treaties back to Washington to be ratified. And the United States Senate, based on pressure from the state government, did not ratify those treaties. So those Indians back in 1851, 1852, in good faith, started moving their property over to those acreage that was negotiated with. But because the United States Senate never ratified the treaties and buried those treaties for 50 years, those Indians, because they had no rights to any of the lands, and they were not considered citizens under California law. They had no rights in the courts. That began what was called the era of the Indian genocide in California from basically 1850 to almost 1900. The Indians had no land, had no rights, and no ability to fight for themselves. That's what began that system there, and this was the only state where that happened. This is why when people talk about the comment that you made earlier, Ted, which was, we live on the unceded land, that's actually legally true. That's exactly how that happened. Now, I don't like to end it on that very, really negative note, but understanding our history and how we got to this point is kind of important for understanding the greater picture of what's going on with all this. So anyways, that is my presentation today. I really appreciate your time, appreciate you having me here today, and I will gladly stay for as many questions that you want afterwards. So thank you so much.